thank you all. Appreciate Secretary Clinton coming. It was a long day for her, but she stayed to the end, and I didn't hear a single word of complaint from her. Heard a little bit from some of the other folks on the dais, but not from her. She's an important witness. You can't investigate Benghazi without talking to the Secretary of State at all relevant times. But as I said this morning, she's one important witness out of what's now more than 50 important witnesses, and there are a couple dozen left to go. So in terms of conclusions drawn, I don't draw conclusions until the end, and there are more witnesses to talk to. So from my standpoint, we keep going on until we're able to interview all the witnesses that we think have access to relevant information. Importantly, access the documents. I did tell you in my opening, count how many times you hear my colleagues to the left ask the executive branch to produce documents. I counted 0. So the 6 of us, 7 of us would be much closer to writing that final report if we could get just a little bit of help in gaining access to the document. So with that,
what did you find the most revelatory piece of information?
You know, everybody's going to have their own perspective on that. I have a very different interpretation of the phrase personal review than the ARB did. I think personal review means exactly what it says, personal review. We had a lot of Q&A this morning about specific security incidences and specific requests, and her response was, I have people and processes in place for that. That's fine. That's a fair answer. But you also need to be prepared to answer why you have people and processes in place for security, but people and processes were not in place for milk, diesel fuel, gasoline, fish, or the drivel of Sidney Blumenthal. I think some of Jimmy Jordan's questioning, well, when you say new today, I mean, we knew some of that already. We knew about the emails. In terms of her testimony, I don't know that she testified that much differently today than she has the previous time she's testified. So I'd have to go back and look at the transcript.
Chairman, if that's the case, people, begs the question, why spend 9 hours on it if you don't think that she produced anything that you hadn't heard before?
Well, I've got to go back and look at the other transcripts to see whether or not she said anything different or not. I just tell you this, you have to talk to the Secretary of State, and you have to talk to her after you gain access to her documents. So I think the better question, Dana, with all due respect, is how the previous committees were able to write their reports without access to what we had access to. That, to me, is a better question.
Mr. Gowdy, did you gain credibility today, do you think, with this committee?
How would I be able to answer that question? I don't know. I thought these were pretty credible folks before we started today, so I don't know. That's up to y'all to report that. I thought it was a constructive interaction, and I was trying to be a little slow with the gavel so she wouldn't get cut off. We tried hard not to cut her off.
Do you feel you got dragged down into a sideshow surrounding Sidney Blumenthal, or do you think the level of focus on him was
you know what? I think rather than folks asking me why I am talking about Sidney Blumenthal, I think the better question is, why was she listening to Sidney Blumenthal? The only reason his name is coming up is because he was the most prolific emailer to her on the topic of Libya and Benghazi. I didn't say advisor, I said emailer. So you're going to have to ask her why this torrent of information, which we now know he didn't even draft. It was drafted by a guy named Tyler Drumheller. I do know this, that when our ambassador had just been, his papers had just been accepted, and he made a specific request for more security on exactly that day, he's being asked to read and respond to an email from Sidney Blumenthal. I mean, you've got to ask her that. I tried today, and maybe you're a better questioner. That's a question for her. I mean, flip it around. We get a tranche of emails, and the most prolific emailer to her on the subject matter is someone who doesn't work for the State Department, doesn't work for the United States government, was expressly rejected by the President or the White House when he tried to work for her. How do you not talk to both him and her about why they were still communicating? Look, she's scrubbing the identifying information when she forwards it. I mean, What does that tell you? So,
Are you saying that she did most of her
People that were caught red-handed coming in illegally and then just in-processed rather than being deported?
gentleman's out of time, but you may answer the question.
I am not, Congressman. I suspect that would have been our sister agency, as you
For
said.
the Border Patrol.
Right, yeah.
But then you had ICE people backing them up. You know you've got a lot of ICE folks there.
Oh, if there were drugs on them, and we had our hands on them, we wouldn't have let them go.
Well, they were never captured. That's the point. But anyway, it's now on your radar, and it really needs to be dealt with, and I appreciate the chairman's indulgence. Thank you.
The gentleman from Texas yields back. Director, I want to thank you for your patience this morning. I'm last. I'm going to bounce to a couple of different topics. If it's confusing, it's only because of the question.
Yeah.
We're going to start with visas and schools. Would it be helpful to your student visa fraud enforcement efforts if all schools that accept foreign students were required to be accredited?
It makes a difference, sir, of course. It makes a difference to have accredited institutions that will be partners with us in our efforts to keep track of students who are coming in from foreign countries.
How much of an issue has it been, or have you seen these kind of visa mills where you bring students here with no expectation that they actually pursue an education?
Well, we had a tremendous case announced. That I was there at the press conference with my counterpart, with my former colleague, Paul Fishman, the U.S. Attorney in New Jersey, where we brought down a university that was just an academic mill. Very proud of that work done by our Homeland Security investigation agents who had a elaborate undercover operation going on, and there were multiple, 18, 19, for example, for some reason is coming to mind, of people that were involved in that. It's a matter we take great interest in and focus our investigations on.
Well, I'm going to ask you about two reports, and then you can tell me whether the reporting is accurate, and if so, if there's an explanation what that may be. There's a report that you have asked for less money for alien detention and less money for fugitive operations. Is it true that your request was for less money, and if so, why?
My request?
Yes, ma'am.
I think the Department of Homeland Security submits a broad request for all agencies. Obviously, they consult with all of us. But I would not have asked for less money in those areas.
Okay. There's another report that at least in previous years, occasionally, ICE attorneys would not appear for hearings in front of judges. And that probably strikes you and I as being unusual, that the government attorney would not be there. Have you heard that? Was it a practice? Is it still a practice?
That is an issue that I am sure would have come to my attention if it were in any way systemic. Has one missed a hearing here or there? I wouldn't be apprised of that. But I assure you that I have met so many of these attorneys, I can't imagine that being a practice and a report that's really valid. I'm not familiar with the report you're talking about, but our lawyers wouldn't just ignore a court setting.
Well, that's why I ask, and I make no presumptions as to the validity of that report. But if you could have someone, not yourself, but just somebody check to see whether or not that is currently an issue or was an issue in the past. It is hard for me to understand how the government can be represented if the attorney doesn't show up, but you would have that same feeling because you had the same job. So. Last two issues, sanctuary cities. When I go back home, and I suppose it's true for Johnny in Texas, it is really hard for the people we represent to understand, particularly in light of what they perceive to be a federal government that is willing to get involved in certain state and local issues, not being as animated about jurisdictions that consider themselves sanctuary cities. So I heard you say you're working on it. Other than the power of persuasion, which may or may not work, what tools do you need to be able to get local jurisdictions to cooperate?
Well, I know that I'm going to have to tout our success, though, Congressman, with respect to the 17 of the 25 that I targeted, the 25 that have the most impact on our declined detainers. We have 17 working in a very robust manner with us. So the Secretary did something right in his communications with local law enforcement in different places that he went to as the deputy, and myself personally did. But I believe our message is getting through. I think that's an indication of our message getting through, that there are real problems, not the least of which is the safety of our officers who are going out there to make apprehensions because we couldn't get the cooperation of a local jail to turn over folks. But we continue in our work. I think there's some communities that I'm just not sure we're ever going to get to the point we need to get to, but we're going to keep trying, all of us. I have that specific instruction from the Secretary.
All right, last question. Zavadas. There are not that many things on Capitol Hill that are bipartisan, but dealing with the decision in Zavadas would be one of them. I've had a number of my friends on the other side of the aisle have constituents impacted by that Supreme Court decision. What can we do, or what can you and I and you and Congress do together? It is impossible to explain to constituents why in some instances countries who benefit from foreign aid from us will not accept their foreign nationals back. It is just hard to explain that. So what do we need to do to get the State Department more fully engaged, so it's not you and me answering the question, because it's really up to them? So what can Congress do about Zavadas?
Okay, well, I see two different issues here. One is the work with these countries that are not taking their people back, and the other one is the decision that compels us to release people. Sir, I've read that decision. I don't know if you have. It is very legal in nature, but the bottom line there is the constitutional concerns of holding somebody indefinitely when there is little chance that we're going to be able to return them to their countries. You're right. None of our people like doing that, and it hurts us in our heart of hearts that is the deal. But I am happy to consider and work with you any options that you have with respect to those countries. I am working diligently with Michelle Bond, the Chief of Consular Affairs. She has really taken a personal interest and made a commitment to me that we're going to take a look at each one of these countries and do what we can. The world is a complicated place, as you know, and I would not put myself in the shoes of the Department of State to know all the ramifications of a sanctions decision, for example, against a country with whom our relationship is complex, to say the least. And I don't know all those ramifications. All I know is that I have a difficult problem to deal with, and she is working with me at Department of State to try to get to a better place than we are today.
Well, with the indulgence of my friend from California, because this is a bipartisan issue, Congresswoman Lofgren and I have discussed it. Congressman Courtney has an issue. Congressman Welch on the other side of the aisle. What is the dominant explanation given from countries who will not accept their nationals? But what is their excuse for not doing so?
Quite frankly, in many instances, there is no explanation. Some of the factors are instability of a country. I mean, what do we do with Syrians? You know, returning them to their country. That country is in the throes of terrible turmoil. So often it's instability. It's a claim that our proof of citizenship is not sufficient, even though we believe it is. It's the lack of records and the lack of records kept by certain governments, that they just don't value record keeping the way we do, and so establishing citizenship becomes a problem. It's a varied picture of things that are brought up to us as to why they will not accept their people back.
All right, I would ask my friend from California if he had any concluding remarks. We want to, on behalf of all of us, thank you for your service and for your testimony today. And I guess members will have 5 legislative days to submit questions to the record. And with that, we thank you for your time.
Thank you.
In the consent decree. Ms. Gupta, given that there are legitimate concerns in the New Orleans policy by folks here, did you seek a judicial review of the policy by district court to determine whether or not it complied with Section 1373?
The district court at both points, both in February and in issuing this revised policy, had reviewed the policies. Yes.
Well, my time's expired, but since the Attorney General doesn't respond to any of my letters, Ms. Gupta, I wonder if you might carry a message to her, and that message would be on behalf of my constituents and millions of Americans, that if she really believes in enforcing the rule of law, then I think she ought to be prosecuting jurisdictions that violate federal immigration policy instead of writing them checks. And with that, I yield back, Mr.
Mr. Chairman, from Texas yields back. The chair will now recognize himself. Mr. Butterworth, what's the penalty for crossing a border unlawfully?
I would defer to the Department of Justice on any.
Well, let's try it this way. Who has exclusive jurisdiction over immigration cases?
Again, it's outside of my lane, but I would say it's CBP or ICE.
So it'd be federal. It's exclusively federal.
Yes, sir.
Both, and they're really, unless you can think of something I can't think of, it's either crossing a border unlawfully or overstaying a visa would be about the only ways you could get in the country unlawfully. Only 2 ways I can think of. You either cross one of our territorial boundaries or you're invited in and you overstay your visa. And those are both exclusively federal. But I think you'll agree with me that almost all of our interactions in life are with state and local law enforcement. It's not an FBI agent who stops us for speeding. It's not an ATF agent who is working the bar scene. So if most of our citizen police encounters are state and local, and yet immigration is exclusively federal, how are the federal officers supposed to know about folks who are not here lawfully?
Sir, the Department of Homeland Security has the PEP program, which I am not at liberty to speak on. But I would say if Congress passed a law that commandeered every local police officer and wanted to pay for that, then I think we would welcome it.
When you say, well, commandeer is such a pejorative word, how about we just say cooperate? I mean, you don't commandeer people for your terrorism task forces, do you? You don't commandeer people for your narcotics task forces, do you? It's called cooperation. And yet you have a policy that says that New Orleans Police Department members shall not make inquiries into an individual's immigration status. What do you mean by inquiries?
Sir, if there's a criminal in New Orleans and an officer interacts with that person and there's a criminal warrant, that person.
See, I don't know what you mean by criminal. You mean if the person has, if there's probable cause to believe that an offense was committed, or if there's already an outstanding warrant?
If there's a state, federal, or local warrant or probable cause that an officer observes conduct that's criminal, they will arrest the person.
All right, and then they can inquire as to the person's status.
Our officers under this policy do not inquire about a person's immigration status.
They can or cannot?
Under this policy, they do not inquire about a person's immigration status.
Why not?
Because we believe that, one, this follows federal law, and two...
How are the federal law enforcement officers supposed to know who is here unlawfully if your officers don't inquire? They're not the ones that are interacting with them. They're not enforcing traffic laws. They don't respond to domestic violence calls. The FBI doesn't have jurisdiction over that. That would be your state and local officers. So how is that supposed to happen?
Sir, I think your concerns are with the broader system and not with this policy. In New Orleans, we arrest every criminal that we interact with. We bring them to the jail.
I love the way you phrase that. You arrest every criminal you interact with. They're only a criminal after they've had a jury trial, Mr. Butterworth. They're a suspect up until that point.
Correct.
Mr. Horowitz, if their original policy was okay, why did they revise it?
I don't know the answer to that question, Mr. Chairman. You'd have to ask the Civil Rights Division.
Well, you're a good lawyer, Mr. Horowitz. If the original contract was fine, you usually don't draft another one unless you just love paying lawyers. I mean, if your original indictment was okay, did you have a superseding indictment?
Generally not.
No, you don't. So if the original policy is fine, why did we get this brand new policy?
Well, obviously, our memorandum outlining the concerns we had about the provision that then existed may well have triggered the revisions.
I hate to be cynical, but I think you're right. Ms. Gupta, you said you were a prosecutor. That was a question I got way back in time that I never really had a good answer for. Whenever a family member who had lost a loved one to an act of violence, to someone who was out on bond, would ask me, why was that person out of jail? I never really had a good answer. I mean, you can cite the Constitution that you're really entitled to bond absent some circumstances, but that's kind of a hollow explanation. So what would the explanation be to those who have lost loved ones to violent crime for people who are here unlawfully and the federal government knows it?
There is, for somebody who's been accused of a violent crime, the NOPD is absolutely entitled and in its authority to prosecute to the law to the fullest. And there's nothing in this policy.
You're either missing my point inadvertently or you're missing my point intentionally. I realize you prosecute people after the homicide. I'm trying to figure out how to prevent the homicide. What is the explanation for why the person wasn't dealt with before the murder?
Well, let me just again make clear that the reason we undertook the policy was to ensure that NOPD could fight violent crime, could get the kind of critical information from victims and witnesses who need to share critical crime information with the NOPD in order to solve and prevent violent crime in that
Ms. Gupta, you and I both know that we rely on all sorts of witnesses, some of whom, frankly, expose themselves to criminal liability in the process of cooperating. So the notion that you have to give amnesty to people before they will cooperate with law enforcement has not been my experience. But Attorney General Landry, I'm out of time. You asked the question, how do you answer it when family members ask you, why was this person not dealt with before they committed the act of violence? I never really had a good answer to that one.
Unfortunately, I've had to answer that question in Louisiana here lately. And the best way I answer them is that our system in this country is broken.
With that, I would thank all the witnesses.
Chairman, can I ask unanimous consent for 1 minute, please?
Well, if the gentleman from Texas does it, then I'm sure the gentleman from Texas and the gentleman from Colorado are going to want to do it too.
Let me be very brief, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, you can have a minute.
Thank you so very much. First of all, I want to make it very clear that I don't think there's one member here does not feel the deep pain for the families who lost loved ones, particularly those who died in the terrible crash trying to help others during the Baton Rouge disaster and flooding. I'm from Texas, and I feel for my brothers and sisters in Louisiana, and I was there for them in Katrina, so my deepest sympathy. I do want to make sure, however, General Landry, you're not asking for New Orleans to be prevented from getting federal funds. Is that correct? You're not asking us to block New Orleans from getting federal funds.
I'm asking New Orleans to follow federal law, like I would ask all of the
but
cities
you're not
in New
asking.
Orleans.
I understand, but you're not asking for there to be a declaration for New Orleans not to receive federal funds from the Department of Justice.
No, I've been asking for the state to withhold funds from New Orleans for violating federal law.
Okay, but let me ask Ms. Gupta, is New Orleans violating federal law?
No, New Orleans, under this policy, the policy does not violate federal law, and right now we're working with the City of New Orleans to ensure constitutional policing.
That they're communicating with ICE and you're not blocking that, because that's what I want to make sure is happening.
That's right. The policy makes clear that NOPD can communicate with ICE and request information from ICE.